This section is coming to a close, but there are still 3 or 4 videos left as there are still a few topics that I'd like to cover. We're going to take a look at some new syntax improvements to the language that we can use when working with function arguments, arrays, and objects. With this video in particular, we're going to be looking at REST parameters and the spread operator, allowing us a new way to work with our function arguments. To mess around with these new tools, let's head into the boilerplate project, and we're just going to add a bit of code into index.js in the source directory. Before we do, let's make sure the dev server is actually running for that app. cd:/boilerplate, then npm run dev-server. Once the dev server is up and running, we're just going to mess around with the syntax for both of those things. Now, both the REST parameter and the spread operator relate to function arguments, so let's go ahead and get a function in place. Let's create a new const for our function. I'm going to call this one calculate average. This is going to take in a few numbers, and it is going to return the average number. So if I were to pass in 0 and 100, I would expect the average to be 50. This could be useful for all sorts of things, like calculating a grade in a class. So right here, I might take in number 1, and I might have number 2. Then I am just going to return our calculation. So what do? We just add num1 to num2. We then take that sum and we divide it by the total number of things we added, which in this case is 2. And that is going to give us the average. Down below, we're going to go ahead and actually use it, printing the value to the console. So right here, let's go ahead and use console.log. We're then going to call calculate average, and we'll stick with some easy numbers, 0 and 100. The average should be 50. I'm going to save index.js and refresh the browser in the background so it connects to our boilerplate project. And right here, what do we get? We get 50 printing in the console. Now, calculate average is indeed working as expected, but it's not a very good function because it's not flexible. If I wanted to add a few more numbers in, like 88 and 64, the function would now need to be changed in order to account for that. What would be a bit more ideal is if we had a list of numbers in calculate average that we could loop over to add everything up, then we could just divide the sum by the array's length. Now, there are 2 ways we could do that. The first is to pass in an array to calculate average instead of passing in individual arguments. I would pass in a single array of numbers. I would then access that up here and use it in the function body. The alternative, though, allows us to stick with the current call syntax, where we pass in 4 separate arguments. This is using the REST parameter. We can use the REST parameter to grab all of the arguments passed into a given function. So let's go ahead and remove everything from the arguments list, and instead of naming the first 2 arguments, num1 and num2, we're going to use the REST parameter to grab all of the arguments passed in and store them in an array. The REST parameter starts off with 3 dots, so ... followed by a variable name. I'm going to call this one numbers. Now, inside of calculate average, we have access to an array, numbers, and the numbers array is populated with all of the arguments passed in to the function. So in this case, numbers would be an array with 4 elements, the first 0, the second 100, the third 88, and the final one 64. Now that we have the REST parameters set up, we can actually add in a dynamic calculation, getting the average for however many numbers happen to be passed in. Right here, let's knock that out. Let sum equal 0, then down below, numbers.forEach. We are going to access the individual number, and all we're going to do is set the sum plus equal to the individual number. So we start at 0 and we add things up over time. Down below, the last line for this function, we can return the sum divided by the array's length. So remember, numbers is just a regular old array, so numbers.length. Now we have a dynamic version of index.js that's going to work regardless of how many numbers we pass in. Right here, we can see we're getting a new average computed for our function call. This time, the average is 63, which is indeed correct. There's one more aspect of the REST parameter I'd like to explore. To explore this, let's pretend that we want calculate average to return a string message as opposed to just returning a number. So instead of returning the number directly, I'm going to store that on a variable, const average equals the result of our previous calculation. And then I'm going to return a template string, and we're going to say something like the average grade is 44. The average grade is, then right here, we're going to inject the thing. So we'll inject the average. Now the problem with this is that we are always assuming that we're calculating the average grade. Maybe we're calculating the average temperature or the average age of a group of people. We want this piece to be dynamic too, and we'll let the caller pass that in. So let's say we want that to be the first argument. Right here, grade, for example. Then, right here, we want to be able to use that value. The problem with this is that we now have grade, the string, as the first item in that numbers array, which means that this code is going to break because we're going to try to add that string onto the sum, which isn't going to work as expected. With REST parameters, we can indeed grab all of the arguments, but we can also choose to just grab a subset of them. If I want the first argument as its own thing, I can name that. So right here, I could call this one thing. What is the thing we're calculating the average of? Then comma space followed by the REST parameter. Now we are isolating that first argument, storing it in a variable called thing. Then we're grabbing all arguments after the first one and storing that on the array numbers. Now I can correctly access this down below. Right here, I will interpolate that value thing. This is going to work as expected. We'll be able to see grade here, and our average calculation isn't going to get messed up because once again, numbers is just storing numbers. Now we could choose to break off as many arguments as we needed. We might also choose to break off the second one, calling it something like first number. Now first num would equal 0, and the numbers array would have 3 items, 100, 88, and 64. I just wanted to show you that this was possible, though we don't actually need first number. Let's go ahead and run the program and see what happens. Over in the console, what do I get? I get the average grade is 63. If I were to swap this out with something else like age, I should get the average age is 63, and that's exactly what I'm getting. So using REST parameters gives us a bit of flexibility when designing our functions. Now it's challenge time. It's going to be up to you to create a function on your own using REST parameters. Down below, I have a few comments outlining exactly what this function should do. So the function itself, called print_team, should take in a few arguments. The first argument is going to be the team name. The second argument is going to be the coach. Then all other arguments are going to be the players on the team. You might have 2 players, you might have 40 players. And those are all going to get passed in as individual arguments like we did with our numbers above. Down below, the goal is to use console.log in that function 3 times to print 3 pieces of information. First up, we have team with the team name. In this case, it's Liberty. The next line is coach with our coach's name. In this case, it's Casey Penn. And the third and final line, players, has a comma separated list of all of the players on the team. Now, I'm not going to give you anything for the print team function, but I will show you how the function should be called to make sure we're on the same page. You're going to be calling print team. You'll be passing in those arguments like Liberty for the team name, Casey Penn for the coach's name, Marge as the first player, then Aiden, then Herbert, and finally Sherry. So it's your job to get this stuff printing when we have a function called like this using REST parameters. Take some time to knock this out, then test your work. Make sure you're getting the exact same output shown above for the function call down below. When you're done, come back and click play. How'd that one go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by creating this function. So const print team equals a new function, and this function is going to have some arguments set up. So I mentioned that the first one is team name. We could call that something like team or team name. Both would get the job done. Then we have our coach. So right here, the second argument, coach. Then we have our list of players, and we don't know how many players are going to get passed in. Maybe it's 2 arguments, maybe it's 4 like down below. So we're going to be using REST parameters to grab the rest of the arguments. So right here, we're going to grab the rest of the arguments, storing them under an array called players. Now we can move on and actually set up those 3 console.log calls. So the first one, using a template string, team, : space, followed by the team name, pretty straightforward. Then down below, another console.log inside of a template string right here, coach, colon space, followed by the coach's name. Once again, just a standard argument. That brings us to the last one, which is our array of players. So console.log, right here, inside of a template string, players, colon space. Then we're going to print a comma separated list of all players. So players dot join, joining right here with a comma and a space. Now we're all done and we can actually test things out. I'm going to save index.js. The browser is going to refresh. And what do we get? We get those 3 lines printing. We have Team Liberty, Coach, Casey Penn, players, Marge, Aiden, Herbert, and Sherry. So there we go. Using the REST parameter, we were able to set up our arguments to grab all of the players as an array, then use the join method down below to print them all correctly. All right, that is it for this video, and that is it for REST parameters. We're going to continue on with a few more topics similar to this in the next one.